In this video, I'm going to talk about Corsair's brand new SSD, the MP700 Elite. Now, this is the first drive that uses Phison's latest Gen 5 controller, and it is also the first proper Gen 5 SSD to drop the DRAM cache and use host memory buffer instead. Now, DRAM-less drives are still quite controversial for a lot of you, but keep in mind that a lot of HMB drives perform extremely well, and most importantly, it lowers the cost of the drive. So this MP700 Elite should become one of the most affordable Gen 5 options on the market. So let's see how it performs, how it compares to other SSDs I've tested so far, and if it's worth getting it or not. Let's begin. The MP700 Elite is available in 1TB and 2TB capacities, and unfortunately there are no 4TB options, or at least not yet, and you can choose to get a drive without a heatsink or with a pre-installed heatsink for about $10 or €10 more, which is not a bad premium, especially when you consider how well it is built. I also really like the design they went with this time around, even though in most builds you probably won't be able to see it at all. Now, the heatsink is removable, and underneath is a pretty simple single-sided drive with a controller and 2 flash chips. And as I mentioned at the start, it has Phison's new E31 controller that is supposed to be more affordable and more efficient than the older E26 controller that was used for pretty much all Gen 5 SSDs until now. If we look at Corsair's own website, they don't actually list the exact controller and memory they're using, just that it is 3D TLC NAND. And while I do appreciate that they listed some performance numbers other than sequential speeds, if you look a bit closer, they are max numbers, so that doesn't really add that much value either. But since this whole drive is built around the new E31 controller, I don't really expect them to actually change the components that much in the future. You can also see that the power consumption rating of 5.9 watts is significantly lower than the 10 to 11 watts that you can expect from the E26 base drives. It also comes with the expected 5-year-long warranty, 600 total terabytes written per terabyte of capacity, and a typical mean time between failures of 1.6 million hours. Now, as always, I'm going to start with the PCMark 10 Quick Benchmark, which is a nice bundle of tests that simulate a lot of simple things we do with our PCs every single day, like working with documents, for example, like looking at your vacation photos, loading your games, and so on. And this is a very useful benchmark to look at if you're looking for a drive that you mostly want to use for these simple little things. And the MP700 Elite had an average of 716 megabytes per second, which is more in line with the better Gen 4 SSDs than the previous Gen 5 ones. So it's not a bad score, but seeing how well HMB Gen 4 drives performed, I expected a bit more in this test. Now, the full PCMark 10 suite simulates a bit more intense and a bit more serious use of the drive, and this is a great benchmark to look at if you're looking for a new main drive or you need to run some applications that can be very heavy on your SSD, like editing videos, for example. And here, the MP700 Elite ended up where I kind of expected it to be, so in between the top Gen 4 SSDs and the higher-end Gen 5 SSDs. Now, ideally, I would have liked it to be a bit closer to the MP700 Pro SE, which sits at the top of the graph, instead of closer to the Gen 4 T500 and 990 Pro. But again, not a bad score at all. Now, looking at the latency, it is pretty much in line with the previous results, filling the gap yet again between earlier Gen 5 drives and the best Gen 4 options on the market. The consistency test is not that relevant for a lot of you because it simulates a very extreme, a very intense, and a very long multi-hour workload that most of you will never ever do. But I still believe that it is very interesting to see how a drive holds up when you really stress it for such a long time. And as expected, the MP700 Elite did drop here like any other DRAM-less drive, but it also dropped a lot further than I expected it to, scoring below affordable HMB Gen 4 drives. So there are definitely limits to what the new controller can do when you really stress it, and if you plan to do any sort of an intense workload, this is not a great option to go for, especially when you compare it to the 990 Pro, for example, or even Corsair's own MP700 Pro SE that sits at the top of the graph with a result that is almost 7 times higher than this one. Now, 3D Mark Storage is another collection of various tests that simulate a lot of different gaming-related tasks like loading games, installing games, moving game folders around, recording your gameplay, and so on. And of course, this is a very useful benchmark for anyone that needs a drive to use for gaming, primarily. Now here, the MP700 Elite ended up nicely near the top of the graph. It sits just below the best Gen 4 drive I've tested so far, the T500 from Crucial, but above some other Gen 5 drives and most Gen 4 drives as well. And if we look at the gaming results that I personally find most important, which is loading times, installing games, and updating your games, the MP700 Elite scored about 90% of the fastest Gen 4 drive I've tested so far, which is again the T500 from Crucial. That puts it right next to Samsung 990 EVO Plus and Lexar's NM790, both DRAM-less Gen 4 drives. It scored higher than some Gen 5 drives like the T700, but it is still very far away from the MP700 Pro SE that has a very similar name but tops the chart here with a margin of almost 40% over the Elite. Sequential read and write performance numbers don't really represent proper real-life use as well as previous benchmarks do, but it can still be a very useful metric for some people. When it comes to sequential writes, Corsair claims that this drive should do 8500 megabytes per second, but in reality it does a little bit more than that, which puts it ahead of Gen 4 drives that cannot really do higher than 6500 to 700. But it is still behind other Gen 5 options on the market. In sequential reads, it is just shy of 10,000 megabytes per second, so it ended up somewhere between the top-tier Gen 4 drives and other Gen 5 drives yet again. It is well above Sony's required speed for PlayStation 5 use, but since you cannot use HMB in a PlayStation 5, it doesn't make that much sense to go for this drive. A DRAM-based Gen 4 drive would be a much better choice in this situation. When it comes to thermals, the new controller is definitely less power hungry than the old one, and with the included heatsink, the temps were quite comfortable, even when you really stress the drive. Now, I would still recommend that you use some sort of a heatsink, but thermals are not nearly as much of a problem as they were with previous E26-based Gen 5 drives. So the MP700 Elite is definitely an interesting drive in some ways, considering it is pretty much the first Gen 5 drive that wants to focus more on value instead of just top-end performance. And even though its performance is nicely in between Gen 4 and Gen 5 options we've seen so far, I would have preferred it to be a bit closer to those Gen 5 options instead of just competing with the best Gen 4 alternatives on the market. And as a DRAM-less model, it isn't nearly as good as other Gen 5 drives when it comes to really intense workloads. So the fact that it uses the same MP700 name as the MP700 Pro SE, that is an excellent performer in every situation, is not the best choice in my opinion, and it's a bit misleading because they are a class apart, at least. If we look at the local prices here in the Netherlands, you can get a 2TB P41 Platinum for 120 euros, SN850X for 150 euros, a Crucial T500 for 155 euros, or the Samsung 990 Pro for 170 euros. So for this drive to make sense, it would have to be somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit more if you go for the heat-synced version. But the recommended retail price of the MP700 Elite is 300 euros for the 2TB model, which makes no sense at all. That being said, the recommended price of every single SSD is ridiculously high at launch, and it always drops down very quickly. So right now, I would not recommend getting this drive, but if the price goes down even further or you find a very good deal in the future, it might make sense a bit more, just not yet. Now that's all I had for today, but before I go, let's check out the sponsor of this video. This video was brought to you by Seasonic and their Vertex power supplies. These fully modular power supplies are extremely efficient and very quiet due to their fan design and their hybrid fan mode that stops the fans completely under 40% load. They come with a variety of connections for any kind of system you have in mind, including the 12-volt high-power cable for the latest NVIDIA graphics cards. And to wrap it all up, they now offer a nice and cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. Now, thank you all for watching and sticking to the end. I really hope this video was interesting and helpful enough. If you liked it and you want to see more videos like this one, please do consider clicking that subscribe button so you never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!